internet and I was looking at tips for parents, and I thought I'd share some with you. These are shared by real parents on Twitter. It says, parenting tip number 1, pick your battles. And so this is like giving a kid a piece of bread. I think that would make Edna happy as well. Just like give her a big loaf of bread. Parenting lesson of the day. When pouring your guts out to the baby at 3 a.m., make sure the monitor is turned off. So that's the second one. Parenting tip. Do not let your 4-year-old watch Tangled and leave her anywhere near scissors. Parenting tip. If your 2-year-old calls you in from another room to tell you she's not poopy, there's a 100% chance she's lying. Parenting tip. Train your kids to kill spiders so that they can be the ones to do it. I read that, I was like, oh, that's so smart. Parenting tip. Take your kids to the pumpkin patch. Let them pick out any pumpkin they want, but make them carry it to the car. They'll never want to go again. So our sermon today is about raising children. The question I want to ask is, how should Christians raise children? And this is not really a natural question for me, because for most of my life I never took much of an interest in kids. I only had to learn how to hold a baby a few years ago when I had to do a baby dedication, and I thought, oh shoot, I'm expected to hold a baby, so I had to learn off of YouTube for how to hold a baby. I'm just not interested naturally in kids. And yet, over the last few years, it's become quite apparent to me that raising children is possibly the most important thing that we can do. And this question, how should Christians raise children, this might be the most practically important question in all the Christian life. And even if you aren't a parent, you have a super important role, because the work of raising children is so utterly important, and we need everybody involved. It takes a village to raise a child, they say, and we need your help as we raise the next generation. So the question, once again, is, how should Christian raise children? And my answer is with purpose, with time, and with joy. We will find these 3 themes in our Bible story today. So our story today centers on a guy named Absalom. I bet you've never heard of, bet you've never met anybody named Absalom before, for the same reason that you've probably never met anybody named like Judas or Adolf or Thanos. You just don't want to name your kid Absalom. This is a very disappointing story. But his story was put into the Bible to teach us a really important lesson, possibly one of the most important lessons in the Bible. Just to give you some context, this is the last sermons in the sermon series in the life of David. And so this entire section of the Bible that we've been in has been one big explanation about the life of David. And Absalom was a son of David. And these chapters on Absalom actually fit into the much larger story of the King David. And David is still the main character in this part of the Bible, and David is still the one that we're supposed to be relating to the most. Actually, if you think about it, in all the Bible, there are actually very few people who are more similar to you than David if you're a Christian. You might think at first glance David is not so similar, like he was given a special promise from God. He was given the presence of God and the power of God. He was promised a kingdom. But if you think about it, so are we. We as Christians are giving the presence of God and the power of God, and we have been promised a kingdom as well. And so as we read the stories of David, we are David. And as we read this Absalom part of David's story, we read it as a parent or somebody who's interested in raising the next generation. Now, there are 3 principles that David failed as a parent. The first principle was purpose. David didn't raise Absalom with a sense of purpose. And we find this failure in the beginning of Absalom's life. I just want to read to you from the beginning, from 2 Samuel chapter 3. The Bible tells us about David's family, starting at verse 2. It says, sons were born to David in Hebron. His firstborn was Amnon, the son of Ahinoam of Jezreel. His second, Chileab, the son of Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. The third, Absalom, son of Maacah, daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. The fourth, Adonijah, son of Haggith. The fifth, Shephatiah, the son of Abital. The sixth, Ithream, the son of David's wife, Eglah. These were born to David in Hebron. At first glance, this is one of those boring passages that you want to skip over. It just has these really long, complicated names, and it doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense at first. But if you take a look and you look at it more closely, this passage is actually explosive. There's a lot going on here. Notice that David had 6 wives in this list. Ahinoam, Abigail, Maacah, Haggith, Abital, Eglah, and this is not including his other wives. We know of at least 2 more. There was Michal, daughter of Saul, and there was Bathsheba later on. So at least 8 wives that David was married to. Add to that at least 10 concubines, which are like second-class wives, and David had at least 18 women in his love life. Something feels messed up about that. And David's Bible actually had specific commandments regarding the king of Israel that he must not take many wives. And so when we read the beginning of Absalom's story, we should think something feels wrong here. There's too many wives. There's one more thing in our passage that is also not right. But you need to understand a little bit of background in order to appreciate how wrong it is. When you read the line about Absalom, it says, Absalom was the son of Maacah, daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. And so this line tells us that before Absalom was born, David married the daughter of the king of Geshur. And that made it a forbidden marriage because Geshur was one of those nations that Israel was not supposed to be friends with. There was actually a commandment in the Bible forbidding marriage to these kinds of nations. God had told the people of Israel not to make a treaty with the people of Geshur and instead drive them out of the Holy Land. But here, David married a princess from the king of Geshur. And there's a hint to us that this is probably a political alliance because that was standard practice among kings back then. The royal families, they would intermarry among each other and they would become family, and they'd say to each other, okay, we're family now, let's work together, let's not fight. And politically, that makes perfect sense. But in his relationship with God, this actually was outside of his relationship with God. And so from the beginning, David's family lacked spiritual purpose. And this beginning led to a lot of trouble down the road. But I have to say, it's actually very normal to lack spiritual purpose in your family. Nowadays, one of my favorite parts of my job is to do premarital counseling. So Pauline and I, we invite couples into our home, and we just have a series of conversations to help them prepare for their first year of marriage. It's a good time. And we have a series of conversations, and one of these conversations is about children. We ask couples, do you want to have children? And the couples are kind of like cuddling together on the couch, and they're all happy to talk about this kind of stuff because, this is something they talk about in their dating days. But then we ask them a much harder question. We ask, why do you want to have children? And even though we tell them that we're going to ask them this question before, it's in their homework, people are usually not ready to answer this question. It's a hard question. Why do you want to have children? Turns out different people want children for different reasons. Some people just like kids. Other people feel a lot of social pressure to have children, either from their parents or from their friends. Other people just have a really strong biological urge. They just feel like they need to have children. But if those are your kinds of reasons for starting a family, then you will be like David, you will start your family life without a clear spiritual purpose, and a lack of purpose leads to problems. When I was in construction, my boss shared a cartoon in my office. He said construction projects are kind of like this. He says, this is how back one slide. This is how the customer explained it. He says, I want a tree swing. Right? And this is how the business consultant described it. This is how the analyst designed it. This is how the customer was billed. And this is what the customer really needed. My coworkers liked that comic because it's actually kind of true in construction industry. There's a lot of chaos and confusion in construction. There's a lot of inefficiency. It's really messy. But if the purpose in construction we find is clear from the very beginning, there's a lot less of this weird stuff going on. There's a lot less problems down the line if you just know what you want from the beginning. And so it is with raising children. You can save a lot of grief if you are crystal clear from the very beginning on why you want children. And you need to see how exactly children fit inside of your relationship with God. So I'll tell you why I want children. And this is a question that I've personally had to answer myself. It's very urgent for me to answer because I was going to have a kid, and I am not naturally a kids person. I don't care about social pressure. I do not have biological urge to have children, right? That's just not me. I'm a video games person. And I need to figure out a reason for why I need to have, why children fit in my life so I don't become bitter as a father. And I found a reason, a really good reason. I want children because children are powerful. Or at least they can be powerful, and they're meant to be powerful. One child trained properly will go on to impact thousands of lives. I want children who will represent Jesus in their generation. I want children who will do things that I never will be able to do. I want children who will impact eternity in ways that I never could. I want children who will have children of their own and raise their children the same way so that my family line will go and impact our country for hundreds of years and reach thousands and tens of thousands of people. That's the potential that there is in children. Children are incredibly powerful. And as a Christian, my goal is to please God and to share in His joy and to maximize the joy of heaven. That's what I'm always talking about. That is what my entire life is meant to be like. And this children thing actually fits in that because possibly the most powerful way we can pursue a lasting joy is to raise a family well. And that's why I want children. And because I see children like that, I've actually developed kind of an unusual fear. I'm actually afraid of having too few children. I'm actually afraid that one day I will look back and I will think to myself, I could have had one more. I could have raised one more person to be a disciple. Impacted eternity. And I'll regret the opportunity to create joy. And so I recommend this mindset for you. Don't just have children because everybody else is doing it. You have to have a clear sense of purpose, that you are raising a disciple who will impact their generation and impact eternity. And that's how children fit in our relationship with God. Even if you're not a parent, there's so much we can do for children, even if you're not a parent. And that's how we avoid the first mistake that David made, which was to have a lack of spiritual purpose. Second principle in raising children is time. King David didn't give Absalom the time he needed. I'm getting this from 2 Samuel 14:28. It says, Absalom lived 2 years in Jerusalem without seeing the king's face. Mind you, there was some drama going on, but just in general, this is part of a much larger pattern that David had no time for Absalom. Now, if there was anybody in the country that had an excuse not to give time to their children, it was David. Like, David was the commander-in-chief of the army. He was fighting wars. He was overseeing a country, making sure that whole cities were okay. He was passing laws. He was writing stuff that would eventually make it into the Bible. Like, he was in really important work. So if anybody had an excuse, it was David. But really, there is no excuse to neglect your family, not even for someone like David. I'll tell you why. It's because the greatest commandment in the Bible is pointing us directly to our family. Most of you know the greatest commandment in the Bible. We find it in Deuteronomy chapter 6. It says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength. But most Christians don't remember what happens next, what it says next. It says, these commandments I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. This is the first application of the greatest commandment, is to make sure your kids get it. I'll keep reading it. Talk about these commandments when you sit at home, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. The idea is to make every effort to teach your children the love of God. Talk to your children when you're sitting, when you're walking, when you get up, and when you lie down. Do arts and crafts for your children so that they'll get it. And all this child raising takes time, and all this child raising takes attention. And so you might be wondering, how do you find the time? How do you find the time to pay so much attention to your children? There is a way. When I was in school, I had a professor. His name was Paul Stevens, and he's a very famous, world-famous guy, high-powered professor. He was involved in a lot of stuff. There was one time that Paul Stevens took a vacation. It was a long vacation, probably 2 months long. And came back and he checked his email, and there were hundreds of emails in his inbox. It was insane. And he thought to himself, there's no way that he can get through all this email and still be productive. I mean, it's just crazy how many emails that he had because he just didn't check his email for that long. And so Paul Stevens made a decision. He decided that he would just virtually die on the internet. He would just basically delete his account. He said, just deleted his account, and he sent an email to everybody in his contact list and says, sorry, I've been away for the last couple of months, but I have a new email, so if you have something to send me, please resend it. And then he waited for the sky to fall and the world to end, because this guy was really important. He's involved in so many things. And so he's just waiting for all chaos to break loose, and he waited, and a few emails trickled in. And he waited, the days passed and the weeks passed, and nothing bad happened. And to me, that's a demonstration that outside the home, we're actually pretty replaceable. Even a really important person can just disappear for 2 months, and nothing bad will usually really happen. And so it was even for King David. King David had to run a country, but somebody else could have run it for him. He had to be the Supreme Court judge, but somebody else could have taken the legal cases, and they would have. And if he had taken care of his family, someone else would have even written the Psalms. But only David could be a dad to Absalom. And that's how it's like for us too, if we have children. Outside the home, we're quite replaceable. But inside the home, only you can be a mom or your dad to your kids. So we raise our children first. And when we do that, our commitments outside the home will shrink to their proper size. And that wraps up the second principle of raising children, which is time. The third principle for raising children is joy. And we need to teach our children a kind of happiness that nothing in the world can match. David actually understood joy really well. We see it in the book of Psalms. Psalm 37, David says, "Take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart." He really meant it. Psalm 63, David says to God, "Your love is better than life." And this is not just flattery. This is how he really lived. He really lived, as we see in the stories of David, that God's love was better than life. He really knew God. He really found a joy in God that was better than anything in the world. David's only problem is that he never passed this on to his children. And so in Absalom's case, Absalom developed his own beliefs. I'll read you the last part of Absalom's story from 2 Samuel chapter 15, starting at verse 7. At the end of 4 years, Absalom said to the king, "Let me go to Hebron and fulfill the vow I made to the Lord. While your servant was living at Geshur in Aram, I made this vow. If the Lord takes me back to Jerusalem, I will worship the Lord in Hebron." The king said to him, "Go in peace." Kind of like me. So he went to Hebron. Then Absalom sent secret messengers throughout the tribes of Israel to say, "As soon as you hear the sounds of trumpets, then say, 'Absalom is king in Hebron.'" I want you to notice the way that Absalom used religious language. Absalom knew the name of the Lord. He knew what it meant to worship the Lord and to fulfill a vow to the Lord. He had the external markers of religion, but his heart was somewhere else, and his real plan was to go somewhere else so he could start a rebellion to become king himself. And all of his religious words were just a front. And the scary thing is that story still happens nowadays. It's still possible to raise children who have all the outward markings of religion and have no real relationship with God. It's possible to raise children who go to church, sing the songs, know the Bible stories. Children who hang out with Christian friends and volunteer in the worship team, and they go on mission trips, and they can still not have a real relationship with God. If you want to know if they have a real relationship with God, you should ask a question. You should ask, what is your strategy for happiness? A psychology prof told me, everybody has a strategy for happiness. And your strategy for happiness will affect the entire way you live your life. Last week at camp, it was a great camp. I loved the things that the speaker said. And the speaker's sermons were so powerful that I kept on calling these times a sacred space afterwards, so that people would just talk afterwards and reflect on it. And so I spent a lot of time in the worship space after these sermons. And so one of these times I was just chatting with people inside of our worship space, and a girl from the camp, she joined our conversation group, and she started talking about her insecurities. She said, "I'm really weird." I tried to make her feel better, so I said, "I'm weird too." I said, "If I weren't a Christian, I'd probably be like a drug dealer or a terrorist." She said, "Okay, I'm not that weird." Thanks. But people were curious why I would say that about myself, so I had to explain. If I were an atheist, I'd probably be a drug dealer, because I wouldn't believe in such a thing as right and wrong. Now, no, don't get me wrong, not all atheists are like that. There are some wonderful atheists like that out there. But for me, personally, right and wrong would not make sense to me if I were an atheist. Which means I would have no hesitation about hurting people, no hesitation about breaking the law. And I would be able to do horrible things to other people, provided that I can get away with it. And that kind of mindset would probably lead me into a life of crime. That would be my logical strategy for happiness if I were an atheist. How did I ever become a pastor here? I don't even know. Or say if I grew up in another part of the world and I came under the influence of Islamic extremists, I could easily see myself becoming a terrorist. If I believed that the best way to get into paradise was to fly an airplane into the World Trade Center, I would be the first one to sign up for that, because that would be logical. That would be the logical strategy for happiness for an Islamic extremist. But I'm a Christian. And so I have a different strategy for happiness. My strategy is to follow the example of Jesus, to serve people and to give my life away in love, to live for other people, even though it's not comfortable. And so I work hard for other people. I try to align every part of my life so that I can please God and share in His joy, because that is the most logical strategy for happiness that a Christian can have. And the Apostle Paul talks about this logic in Romans chapter 12. He says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship." The Greek word there behind true and proper is logikos, logical, reasonable. It is your logical worship. This is what makes sense. And Paul goes on to explain in the next verse that God's will is good and pleasing and perfect for people who are thinking straight. You will approve of God's will because it makes so much sense. It is so logical to give your life away and to live for Jesus and to chase the stuff of eternity. And it's this logical strategy for happiness that we have to pass on to our children so that their religion doesn't just turn into a bunch of rules and rituals. We have to set them on a pursuit of joy. And that's what Absalom needed. That's what would have saved Absalom, and that's what will save our children as well. That's what our children need. And we can't rest until our children are chasing after the joy of God. And that's the third principle in raising children well. I'll conclude by summarizing everything I've said, and I'll pray for us. So in summary, the story of Absalom teaches us 3 principles for raising children. And all of this can practice these 3 principles, whether you're a parent or not, and we're invited to. And it's so important that we do so. The first principle is purpose. We have to think of children as possible disciples who will become powerful, and they will go on to change history and help thousands of people. Second principle is time. We give our children priority because it is the first application of the greatest commandment in the Bible. This is what it means to love the Lord. And finally, the third principle is joy. We need to teach our children a better strategy for happiness, better than anything that the world can offer. And these 3 principles are the core of God's plan for raising children. And as we follow His plan, He will lead us into His joy. Let's pray. God, your words are challenging and difficult, but your words are also life-giving and joyful. Give us the faith to follow you when it comes to raising children. For those of us who have children, give us the insight and the perseverance we need to raise them well. For those of us who don't have children, give us the grace to continue to serve the next generation and make disciples. In Jesus' name, amen.